Hello, it's Joseph, and welcome to another episode of Colonizing Kerbin. And in this penultimate episode of the series, we are making our final preparations for the colonists at Laythe. So let's get into it. So this is the Jool Transport Mk, and its purpose is to allow the colonists to travel to the moons of Jool. And it is on its way to Jool at this time, and is making a mid-course correction burn, so that way it can use a Laythe gravity assist to circularize its orbit around Jool. And then next we're on to the Laythe Sample Return Mk. So we're going to launch this sample return craft. We may not see the use of this craft come to fruition in this series, as we will be done colonizing Laythe by the time this gets here, but the purpose for this probe is to land on the surface of Laythe next to where the colonists are living on their island base, and the Kerbins can basically take a bunch of the samples they have collected and put them in this probe. The probe will launch itself into orbit of Laythe, and then we'll rendezvous with the next probe you're going to see launch here in a second, which is the Sample Return Mk. The Sample Return Mk will then take the scientific samples and will return those samples back to Kerbin for scientific study. Now, the idea of this is, of course, inspired by the real-life goals of NASA at Mars, but you know, the concept holds that even though the Kerbins have their own scientific instruments and their own laboratory available to them on Laythe, the Kerbins would still like to have samples returned back to Kerbin for even more thorough scientific study. Obviously, the Kerbins can't take all the biggest and best scientific equipment with them. They could take some pretty state-of-the-art technology with them, but mass is at a premium. So, sending back samples for even more detailed study is, of course, important to the Kerbins. And after all, colonizing their distant relatives of moons and planets is, a main goal for these Kerbins, but scientific study is always a secondary goal in mind for our Kerbins. So there goes the Sample Return Mk on its way to Laythe to eventually rendezvous with its sister ship in orbit of Laythe. So now our Kerbins have finally returned from the Eeloo mission. So this has been a long 7-year journey that started way back in like episode 8 of the series, and we're on the second to last episode of the series, and this crew is finally returning. And this crew, when they enter the atmosphere, they're going to come in pretty fast, so fast in fact that after the fireworks go off, they are actually going to black out because of the extreme G-forces. And the Kerbins are pretty resilient creatures. However, this occurred as well for the crew returning from the Duna mission. This occurred for the crew returning from the Moho mission. So a few years ago, before this crew returned, the astronaut union for the Kerbins actually sued the Kerbal Space Program and demanded much more safer procedures for the Kerbins. So even though the laws have changed, these Kerbins had to endure some rough return down to the surface. But we should no longer see such risky measures being taken because of the valiant efforts of the Kerbin Astronaut Union, which is very fitting because in real life, this episode is going to air the day after Labor Day. So happy Labor Day to all of you watching from the United States. Okay, so back at Laythe, the Aerodrone has been periodically making some scientific flights, gathering data, and of course surveying the best place to land the base. Now, where you saw the Aerodrone take off was at the top of a mountain, which was about 5,000 meters above sea level. Originally, we thought this might be a good place to put the base. It would save the SSTOs a little bit of fuel getting into orbit. However, we found a much better spot down here at the lower end of the island, because there's a little bit more flat terrain. So since we're using a lot of SSTO, or using 3 SSTOs eventually in the next episode to transport Kerbins up and down, it was determined that it would be a little bit better if we had more flatter terrain. And speaking of our base has finally arrived at Jool's sphere of influence, and it is using a gravity assist, the first of many. It's a little low on fuel, so it's going to take several gravity assists to get it to Laythe safely. And after it has arrived, the Laythe SSTO Mark II, which will be the main SSTO transporting crew up and down, is making its alignment maneuver and will, in this episode, show up at Jool and eventually get into orbit of Laythe. So back to the base. The base, of course, took multiple gravity assists from Tylo and from Laythe. I may have had one gravity assist from Val at one point, and eventually you're going to see an aero braking procedure using the atmosphere of Jool. But it took a lot of efforts to get the base into orbit of Laythe because it was pretty low on Delta V. At the same time, the Jool Transport Mk. So while the Laythe base is circling around Jool trying to lower its orbit in line with Laythe, the Jool Transport Mk. Is also doing the same, but it has a bit more Delta V to spare and didn't have to take as much time. So here is the aero braking procedure happening for the Laythe base. It took about 3 or 4 of these to lower the apoapsis down to where I felt it would be best. We couldn't go very far into the atmosphere because this craft is a bit fragile and can't take much atmospheric drag. I mean, it's meant to survive entering the atmosphere of Laythe, as you can see here in just a second, but it can't do so at extreme speeds. So after jettisoning the booster, that booster does have a procore on it, and it will be realigned to crash into Jool. And then these landing boosters on the side of the Laythe base are, of course, going to help land this base. So as you can see, very little fuel left as we're coming in, but as you can see, it can survive the atmosphere just fine when it's coming from a low atmospheric line. But when we had our apoapsis really high up, I even tried to aero capture a few times in Laythe. I didn't show them on screen here, but the base just didn't survive, so I had to go back to previous Quicksaves and just keep trying to get gravity assists to equalize the orbit enough that we could safely capture for a low amount of Delta V around Laythe. Now, we are a little bit off of our target from where the Aerodrone is, but fortunately we have drills and we have a fuel converter, so we're just going to refuel the side boosters, and then we're going to use those side boosters to hop over. All things considering, I got a lot closer to the Aerodrome than I was expecting. This is the second attempt landing the base. This might be about the 40th attempt trying to get the base to move over by the Aerodrome because these side engines aren't perfectly set to the center of mass, and I had several crashes. But I was actually expecting a lot more work to get this base to land close to the Aerodrome, and I think I just got really lucky on the second attempt and got within 2 kilometers, and I determined, you know, that's close enough. Let's start hopping over, and if I ran out of fuel trying to hop over, I would just refuel it with the fuel converter and then just continue hopping over. So just some small hops, several small hops eventually got me over to where I wanted it to be. And then we jettisoned the science truck and are deploying all of the communication dishes and the solar panels. So the base is completely ready to go for the colonists. So now we just got a few other things to finish up this episode before next episode the colonists will arrive, and our final episode of the series is going to fully feature the colonization of Laythe. But while that's happening, once again, our 2 sample return probes are performing their alignment maneuvers, and they are going to finish those up just now, and they're going to have a looks like this one's going to be a Laythe gravity assist to capture once again around Jool orbit. Alright, so moving on, several more days into the future, I have a little alarm set here, and we're going to be doing the same procedure back at Duna. Once again, we may not show this in the series, but you know, time marches on for the Kerbal Space program. And this sample return Mark II probe is going to eventually arrive at Duna and rendezvous with the Mark I probe. Now, the Mark I probe is already at Duna. If you go back to last episode where we finalized our colonization of Duna, the Mark 1 probe was hidden inside the cargo SSTO that is being used at Duna to transport cargo from low Duna orbit down to the base at Duna. So go back to the previous episode to see that sample return probe and to see our colonization efforts paying off back at Duna. And the colonists are doing really well out there. They've sent back some postcards, electronic postcards, and they're just having a blast at Duna and are enjoying the scientific discoveries ahead for them. All right, so the Jool Transport Mk is making its final set of maneuvers and gravity assists to line up with Laythe, and now it's going to make its capture burn at Laythe. So this, I basically am just going to leave it here in orbit, and it will be used next episode because it will eventually rendezvous with the colony ship after it is converted into an orbital base. Once again, we're going to jump back to the Duna sample return, and it's making its final alignment burn, and we'll capture at Duna at some point. And now the Laythe SSTO Mark II has arrived in Jool, and this is going to be our final part of the episode. And it used a Laythe gravity assist, and now it is performing a retrograde burn at low Jool periapsis. And this is going to give it its final alignment, and there's a nice horseshoe shape to that orbital line there, which means that its relative velocity to the planet is going to be close enough that we should easily be able to perform a 3-minute capture burn. Now, it's such a long capture burn, of course, because this is running on a bunch of nuclear engines. And this transfer craft that is attached to the Laythe SSTO Mark II is going to transfer all the liquid fuel that it has into the SSTO so that it is fully fueled and ready. And next episode, we're just going to jettison it in orbit so that it can eventually be used to possibly return Kerbins back to Kerbal if they would like to. Well, that's going to wrap it up for this episode. Here are some beauty shots of the base as it awaits the arrival of the colonists within roughly around 170 days from now in the game. Thank you so much for watching this series, and please come back for our final episode. I will see you next week.